Good morning, class. Hope you're well today. This week's lecture relates to product and service feasibility, specifically how you can define whether or not your product or service will actually be attractive to potential consumer. So one of the most obvious ways of doing this is usually, it comes in three different forms for the most part. Interviewing potential customers is one way, surveying them is another, and also a very common type is called the focus group. So if we just give a brief overview of each one, interviewing potential customers relates to finding your target market first and then interviewing that specific customer or at least a representative member of that customer group in order to understand what their insights, perspectives, feedback, any kind of modifications they might want to a product might be. So for instance, if we think about a company like Instagram, which tends to cater to a younger demographic, what you'd want to do in order to, conduct a meaningful interview with somebody that might be a potential customer for Instagram is to, define that age group. And so in this case, it might be an age group of, let's say, 15 to 20 years old, right? And then from that, you're able to say, okay, if I can find somebody that's 15 to 20 years old and, essentially fill them in on what the company does, what products it offers, how the different things are, executed, or maybe, any new product ideas that you might be thinking of would be very meaningful. So let's do an example. And I know it's a little bit of a, it's already existing, so everyone's familiar with it. That's why it's easier to start with this. But when Instagram started with those, Snapchat, started with those disappearing stories, it became the unique selling point for what they actually had versus the typical ones like Facebook and Instagram, right? So that ability to create, the 15-second short video that once it was seen was destroyed, actually became their unique selling point. So if you were, let's say, a member of Snapchat and you were talking to a potential customer, you might want to introduce that idea, and also say, what would the benefit of this kind of privacy mean to you, right? So you need to ask and structure questions in an interview with a potential customer where you're letting them understand what you're offering. So the first part is establishing, this is what the product does, or this is what the service does. But you're really trying to get to the point of, these are our new ideas. What do you think of them? Okay? And if you think about it in that way, it becomes very simple. Because if you want to be from the perspective of the company, right? If all of a sudden they interviewed, let's say, 1,000 customers and nobody was interested in these disappearing stories, why invest all the money, effort, research, teams devoted to working on these projects when ultimately the customer wouldn't be interested, right? So the interview, I'll come back to it after I've given the definitions of the other ones, but the interview is a core part of determining product or service feasibility. Okay, so if we go to the next step, surveys are obviously easier to provide on a larger scale and also to administer, right? An interview is typically one-on-one. It can take quite a lot of time to actually get, let's say, 100 interviews that involve this one-on-one discussion, as opposed to just sending a survey and, you could send that survey to 100 people, they complete it whenever they want. You can have all the results instantaneously, virtually. So it's a big difference, and that's the benefit of getting something like a survey. So again, if we follow the same example, instead of interviewing that one person one-on-one, you'd want to structure the survey questions so that you're getting to understand the customer's perspective and also what they're interested in. So just like an interview, surveys are very important to be structured correctly. And I'll get back to the point of structuring questions and, how to actually elicit the best responses from your consumers in order to be meaningful. But I do want to touch on the focus group, which is the final one that some of you may or may not be familiar with already. So the concept of a focus group is actually designed to create, a simulation almost of, a representative demographic. So let's say you determined, your consumers were 15 to 20 years old. Maybe they were, both from an upper income as well as a lower income level. Maybe, their specific social graphic interests, like maybe some of them were more involved in community events, or, some of them were less. Some were more social, others weren't, right? You want to find whatever defining characteristics are important to you. You want to include all of those potential customers into a focus group. And same with a survey and an interview, but more so in a focus group, because you're really trying to get a maximum number of useful responses from a limited setting. So it would make sense, let's say, to not have all of the 15 to 20-year-olds be from the same gender, the same income level, or have a similar lifestyle, because ultimately then you're only targeting that one specific group. You can't really say that it's actually applicable to everyone that's 15 to 20. And that's the kind of frame of mind you need to have. So when you're finding interview subjects, or you're trying to find survey subjects or focus group, you need to always try and incorporate every potential customer within your ideal demographic. Okay? Because those different representations, the different worldviews, that's what's going to really generate the best response and give you a better opportunity to actually cater and appeal to many customers at once, right? So now let's go back to the main point of this week's assignment, okay? Entering an interview should be very much structured like the focus groups and the surveys. So first of all, you need to identify the people, right? Once you actually are in the setting, and before that, you need to have thought about these open-ended questions, okay? And some of you may be familiar with open-ended questions. Essentially, what they are is questions that don't result in a yes or no answer, okay? So if I asked you, do you go to Worcester State University? It's very simple to say yes or no, right? And you're not getting any kind of real response from the consumer other than a yes or no. So that's known as a closed question. An open question, on the other hand, is what do you enjoy about studying at Worcester State University, right? And the concept is it's open because if I asked anyone, right, their perception of what they enjoy is different. And they're not going to say, it's not a yes or no answer. So if I asked you that question, you might say, well, I enjoy, studying at Worcester State University because they combine extracurricular activities with, nice classroom settings that are small enough in size where we have an intimate relationship with the professor. So, and that's the kind of response you really want, right? Because the university doesn't want to know whether or not you attend. I mean, yes, that's part of it, but it doesn't generate anything meaningful, right? As opposed to saying, hey, we spoke to 10 or 20 or 100 students. They all said, they really like these small classrooms, right? That could end up being the difference maker. So as a university, they might say, well, we're limiting it so that every classroom only has 20 students because the students really value that intimate connection with the professor. And if we push it up to 30 students, some of that's lost. We might end up losing some of those consumers to another university that keeps those smaller classes. So it's very important to have those open-ended questions because that's what's going to show you not only what drives the customer to come to you, but also what could drive a customer away from you. And you need to incorporate all those aspects into a new and finished product or service. So let's get into the specifics for your assignment. Okay, so the starting point is I want you to find and interview people from that desired demographic, the target market that you've defined for your business, which we've worked on already. And I want you to find at least 3 or 4 representative people from each one of these groups, right? So, each person should end up with 3 to 4 interviews, and you should have a series of questions that are structured in a way to generate the most meaningful responses. Okay, so let's do a few examples. You should always include questions that allow the person to speak to their own experience, right? So you don't want to be leading anyone. So an example, right? If I started a question to you and I said, hey, isn't Worcester State University better than, let's say, Assumption College? It's automatically telling you that my thought is that Worcester State is better. So the likelihood of you responding in a negative way is much reduced, even if you actually feel that way, right? Because in general, we try and connect with the person we're talking to. So you're not as likely to say, no, you know what, I think Assumption is better, even though that may be your thought, because I've already stated my side of the opinion by phrasing it in such a way, right? Hey, don't you think Worcester State is better than Assumption? It's automatically saying to you that I think that. So it makes it difficult for you to present your own opposing argument, unless if you really feel that way. So the better way to structure it would be, which university do you think is better and why, right? So the first part might seem closed-ended because somebody could just say Worcester State, right? But the and why elicits that further response, okay? So even if it seems very difficult to create an open-ended question, most of the time if you include some kind of defining characteristic or further question like an and why, then you're getting to, allow them to make that an open-ended question. So I'd want you to do these interviews, obviously think about questions that specify the product and service feasibility, okay? So whether or not they like it, what ideas they might incorporate, what things they'd want to see different. So let's start with an example that we've worked on in class, right? Those heated gloves. If you think about it, right, maybe a person likes the heated glove idea, but they want it to have increased ventilation, right? So that's something you could find out from an interview, right? So what do you like about heated gloves and what do you think might be some shortcomings, right? Those allow you to create those questions where it's like, well, it sounds great, but how do I know if I touch my phone it won't overheat, right? Or whatever the question might be. You want to know what's troubling the consumer so you can address it, right? So that then when you're marketing, right, if it's said, let's say on the packaging of the gloves, that this is, it warms up your hands. At the same time, it doesn't create, excess heat for any kind of electronics or anything you might be touching, right? So that already says to the consumer, okay, great, I can actually use my phone while I'm wearing these gloves. Problem solved. So that's really what I want you to glean from all this, right? If you can come out of the interviews and have at least 3 to 4 meaningful kind of reasons or additions or changes that you'd make to your product to make it more appealing to a consumer, that's what I really want you to focus on, okay? Draw out those points, that they loved the heated glove idea, for instance, but they wanted to make sure that when they touched their device, it wouldn't overheat, right? You need to include those things. That's what matters more in terms of being able to further specify and, perfect your product for that desired customer. So that's what the core of this week's assignment is, okay? Finding the right people, interviewing them in the right way, creating these open-ended questions, and finding the feedback that can actually help you create a better product for the future. Because when you launch it, you want to be sure it's as possible to appeal to many customer groups as it could be, right? So please focus on that for this week, and I'll look forward to hearing from you next week. Have a nice day, guys. Bye.